I've been driving the graveyard shift for the better part of a decade, hauling high-priority cargo across the desolate stretches of the Pacific Northwest, where the cell service dies and the pine trees grow thick enough to block out the stars. Most people think the hardest part of this job is the fatigue or the black ice that coats the asphalt in winter, but they are wrong. The hardest part is the isolation that plays tricks on your mind when the world is asleep. Out here on Route 9, the darkness isn't just an absence of light. It's a physical weight that presses against the windshield. A living thing that seems to be waiting for your headlights to falter. I learned early on that to survive these roads, you don't just need a reliable engine and a thermos of strong coffee. You need to respect the rules that the old-timers whispered about in the greasy diners off the interstate. They didn't talk about speed traps or deer crossings. They talked about the things that crawl out of the woods when the clock strikes a specific, unholy hour. The most important rule, the one written in the unsaid code of every veteran night courier, was the 3 a.m. rule, a protocol that I had followed religiously since my second week on the job. It was simple but non-negotiable. No matter where you are or how late you are running, when the dashboard clock hits 2:55 a.m., you find a place to pull over immediately. It doesn't matter if it's a designated rest stop, a gravel turnout, or just a wide patch of dirt on the shoulder. You kill the engine, you turn off every single light, and you lock the doors. You sit in absolute silence, and you wait until the clock reads 3:33 a.m. before you even think about turning that key again. They call it the witching hour or the devil's half hour, the time when the veil between our world and the next is so thin you could poke a finger through it. I used to laugh at it, of course, thinking it was just a way for lonely truckers to haze the new guys until I met a driver named Miller in a diner outside of Spokane during my first month. Miller was a giant of a man, shaking with a tremor that rattled his coffee cup, who told me he had ignored the rule once because he was rushing to get home for his daughter's birthday. He said the road changed that night, that the mile markers started counting backward and the radio began picking up voices that knew his name and listed his sins. He swore on his mother's grave that he saw people standing in the middle of the highway, people who didn't move when he honked, people who looked like they had been underwater for weeks. They found Miller's truck a month later abandoned on a service road, the engine running, but Miller was never seen again, vanishing into the fog like smoke. That story stuck with me, lodging itself like a splinter in my brain, and for 10 years I never tempted fate, always finding a safe haven well before the witching hour began. But tonight was different. A blown tire outside of Cascade Falls had cost me 2 precious hours, and the cargo in the back was a medical shipment that had a strict, non-negotiable delivery window. My dispatcher had been screaming in my ear all evening, threatening to dock my pay and terminate my contract if I didn't make up the lost time by sunrise. The pressure was a physical knot in my stomach, overriding my superstition and logic, forcing me to push the speedometer 10 miles above the limit on wet, slick roads. I calculated the distance in my head, realizing I was still 40 miles from the nearest town, deep in a section of woods known as the Narrows. As I entered the Narrows, the fog began to roll in, thick and gray, swallowing the beams of my high beams and reducing my visibility to less than 20 feet. The dense forest on either side of the 2-lane blacktop seemed to lean in, the branches like skeletal fingers reaching out to scratch the roof of my cab. I glanced at the digital clock on the dashboard, the green numbers glowing ominously in the dark cabin. 2:48 a.m. Panic flared in my chest, hot and sharp, because I knew there were no rest stops in this section of the highway, just endless winding road and sheer cliffs. I should have turned back. I should have stopped right there in the middle of the lane. But the fear of losing my job was, in that moment, louder than the fear of the unknown. I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white, my eyes darting between the fog-choked road and the clock that seemed to be ticking faster than normal. 3:50 a.m. 10 minutes. I just needed 10 minutes to clear this pass and find a turnout, or maybe just a wide enough shoulder to park without getting rear-ended by a logging truck. The radio, which had been playing a classic rock station, suddenly cut out, replaced by a low, rhythmic static that sounded like heavy breathing or the ocean crashing against rocks. I reached over to turn it off, but the volume knob wouldn't respond, the static growing louder and more aggressive, filling the cab with a noise that made my teeth ache. 2:54 a.m. I was fully committed now, speeding through the blind curves, praying to a god I hadn't spoken to in years that I would see the gravel patch I remembered being near mile marker 82. But mile marker 82 came and went, and the shoulder remained a steep, unforgiving drop-off into the ravine below, offering no sanctuary for a desperate driver. The air in the cabin suddenly grew frigid, a cold that bit through my flannel shirt and settled deep in my bones despite the heater blasting at full power. My breath began to mist in the air, fogging up the inside of the windshield, forcing me to wipe it away frantically with my sleeve just to see the yellow lines. 2:50 a.m. The silence outside the truck was absolute, heavy and unnatural. No crickets, no wind, just the hum of my engine and the tires singing on the damp asphalt. I saw a sign for a scenic overlook 2 miles ahead, a glimmer of hope that flooded my system with relief. But I knew the math didn't work. At this speed on these curves, it would take me at least 3 minutes to get there, putting me squarely into the danger zone. A voice in the back of my head, sounding suspiciously like Miller's, screamed at me to stop right there on the pavement, to kill the lights and hide. But I didn't listen. I pressed the accelerator down, the engine roaring in protest as I tried to outrun time itself. 2:59 a.m. The seconds ticked away with agonizing slowness, each one feeling like a hammer blow to my chest as the scenic overlook sign appeared again, still too far away in the gloom. I watched the numbers on the clock flicker, the green light seemingly pulsing in sync with my racing heartbeat, mocking my poor choices. The fog outside swirled into strange shapes, looking like tall, pale figures standing just at the edge of my peripheral vision, waiting for the signal to step onto the road. I held my breath, my eyes locked on the horizon, willing the car forward, begging the universe for just one more minute of grace. Then, it happened. The digital clock blinked once, the numbers shifting from 2:59 to 3:00. The moment the digit changed, the headlights of my truck flickered and died completely, plunging me into total, suffocating darkness at 60 miles an hour. The engine didn't stall, but the sound changed from a mechanical roar to a low, guttural growl that didn't sound like a machine at all. And from the empty passenger seat beside me, a space I knew was vacant, came the distinct sound of a seatbelt clicking into place, followed by a soft, dry chuckle. I slammed my foot onto the brake pedal with enough force to snap bone, a desperate reflex to stop the truck before I careened off the blind cliffside in the pitch black. But instead of the screech of tires and the bite of anti-lock brakes, the pedal sank uselessly to the floor, feeling soft and spongy like stepping into rotting fruit. The truck didn't slow down. In fact, it seemed to accelerate, the engine's growl deepening into a roar that vibrated through the chassis and rattled my teeth. I gripped the wheel, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Realizing with dawning horror that I was no longer in control of the machine, the seatbelt in the passenger seat clicked again, louder this time, followed by the sound of wet fabric shifting against the upholstery, the distinct squelch of someone soaking wet settling in for a long ride. The headlights flickered back to life, but they weren't the crisp white LED beams I had installed just last month. They were dim, sickly yellow orbs that barely pierced the gloom. They cast long, distorted shadows against the wall of fog, making the trees look like writhed, agonized figures reaching out to grab the cab as I sped past. The light revealed a road that I didn't recognize, the asphalt cracked and gray, lined with ancient, overgrown weeds that clawed at the tarmac, a stark difference from the well-maintained highway I had been on seconds ago. I tried the door handle, jerking it violently, but it was locked tight. The mechanism jammed as if welded shut from the outside, trapping me in this metal box with whatever was sitting beside me. I refused to look to my right, keeping my eyes locked rigidly on the twisting road ahead, terrified of what my peripheral vision might confirm. But I couldn't block out the smell. It hit me in a wave, a nauseating stench of stagnant pond water, wet mud, and the metallic tang of old blood. It was the smell of a swamp in the height of summer, heavy and cloying, filling the small cabin and making me gag as I fought to keep my eyes on the yellow lines. The temperature in the truck plummeted further, my breath now coming in ragged, visible clouds that froze on the inside of the glass, forming intricate frost patterns that began to obscure my view of the road. The radio, which I had tried to turn off earlier, suddenly flared to life at maximum volume, making me jump in my seat and nearly lose control of the wheel. It wasn't music or static anymore. It was a recording of a voice, my voice, repeating a conversation I had had weeks ago with my dispatcher, laughing about cutting corners on safety checks. The audio was distorted, slowed down to a demonic drawl, looping the phrase, "I don't care, just get it there," over and over again. It was a mockery of my own greed, a reminder of the arrogance that had led me to ignore the warning signs and drive straight into the mouth of hell. I screamed at the dashboard, smashing my fist against the plastic console, but the voice only got louder, drowning out the sound of the engine and the wind. Then I saw her for the first time, a figure standing on the narrow gravel shoulder of the road, illuminated briefly by the weak yellow beams of my headlights. It was a woman in a long white nightgown that clung to her emaciated frame, soaking wet as if she had just dragged herself out of a river. Her hair hung in long black curtains over her face, obscuring her features, and she stood perfectly still, facing the road, her arms hanging limp at her sides. I sped past her at 70 miles an hour, an involuntary cry of shock escaping my lips, expecting the impact of wind to knock her over, but she remained statue still, an anchor in the storm. My rational mind tried to fire rapidly, offering explanations that made no sense. A prank, a hallucination from fatigue, a lost local wandering the woods. But then I saw the mile marker flash by in the gloom. Mile marker 82. I had passed mile marker 82 10 minutes ago before the clock struck 3, which meant I wasn't moving forward anymore. I was trapped in a loop. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead, mixing with the freezing air, as the realization set in that the road was stretching and repeating itself, keeping me in this cursed segment of the forest. I checked the clock again, hoping time had passed, hoping I was close to 3:33 a.m., but the digital numbers remained frozen, mocking me. 3:03 a.m. A mile later, she was there again. The same woman, the same wet nightgown, the same curtain of black hair, but this time, she wasn't on the shoulder. She was standing inches from the white fog line, her body angled slightly toward the truck as if she were waiting to step out. As I flew past her this time, she lifted her head slightly, and even in the blur of motion, I saw that where her eyes should have been, there were only dark, dripping hollows. The radio cut out instantly as I passed her, plunging the cab into a silence that was even worse than the noise, because now I could hear the wet, rasping breathing coming from the passenger seat. "Keep your eyes on the road, Jack," a voice whispered from beside me, a voice that sounded like grinding stones underwater, wet and gurgling. I flinched, my whole body seizing up, tears of pure terror stinging my eyes as I fought the urge to turn my head and look at the speaker. I knew that if I looked, if I acknowledged the presence with my eyes, I would be lost, that my sanity would snap like a dry twig. I gripped the steering wheel until my fingers went numb, focusing on the yellow lines, chanting a silent prayer in my head, begging for the sun to rise, for the loop to break. The truck began to shake violently, the suspension groaning under a weight that shouldn't exist, as if invisible hands were pushing down on the roof, trying to crush the cabin. The dashboard lights flickered and surged, the gauges spinning wildly, the speedometer needle doing full circles while the fuel gauge dropped to empty and back to full in seconds. Outside, the fog thickened to a solid wall of gray, pressing against the glass, and I could see shapes moving within it. Shadowy, elongated figures with too many limbs keeping pace with the truck. They were running alongside me at 70 miles an hour, their movements jerky and unnatural, scratching their long fingers against the metal of the doors. Then, ahead of me, in the middle of the road, the woman appeared for the third time. She wasn't on the shoulder and she wasn't near the line. She was standing dead center in my lane, her arms spread wide in a welcoming embrace. I screamed and wrenched the steering wheel to the left, trying to swerve into the oncoming lane to avoid hitting her, but the wheel locked solid, refusing to turn. The truck barreled straight toward her, and just before impact, she looked up, her mouth opening in a silent scream that revealed rows of needle-like teeth. I squeezed my eyes shut and braced for the crash, waiting for the sound of breaking bones and shattering glass, but all I felt was a blast of freezing cold air passing through the vehicle. The impact never came, but something far worse did. Passing through the woman was like plunging into a bath of liquid nitrogen, a shock of cold so absolute it burned my skin and sucked the air from my lungs. The truck didn't shudder or slow down, but the windshield instantly frosted over completely from the inside, blinding me with a thick, white sheet of ice that defied the heat blasting from the vents. I was driving blind now, hurtling through the dark at 60 miles an hour, my hands frozen to the wheel, waiting for the inevitable crash into a tree or the side of the cliff. From the passenger seat, the wet, gurgling laughter erupted again, louder this time, accompanied by the sound of slow, sarcastic clapping, wet palms slapping together in a mockery of applause for my foolishness. "You missed her, Jack," the voice rasped, leaning closer to my ear, the breath smelling of stagnant river water and decay washing over the side of my face. "But don't worry, she has friends. We all have friends out here in the dark." I squeezed my eyes shut, refusing to look, refusing to acknowledge the presence reciting the Lord's Prayer in my head. But the words scrambled and fell apart in my mind, replaced by the rhythmic thumping of the tires. The truck began to decelerate on its own, the engine sputtering and coughing as if it were choking on the thick fog outside, the power draining away like blood from a wound. The roar of the motor died down to a whimper, then to silence, and the heavy rig coasted to a halt in the middle of the road, the silence of the forest rushing back in to fill the void. Now I was truly trapped. The truck was dead, a 2-ton metal coffin sitting on a forgotten stretch of road in the deepest part of the woods, with no cell service and a ghost sitting less than 2 feet away from me. The digital clock on the dashboard was the only source of light left, glowing with a malevolent green hue, the numbers reading 3:09 a.m. I had 24 minutes left until the witching hour ended, 24 minutes to survive without screaming, without looking, without breaking the final seal of my sanity. I remembered the rule. Kill the lights, lock the doors, close your eyes. The lights were already dead and the doors were jammed, so I did the only thing I could. I let go of the steering wheel, folded my arms across my chest, and squeezed my eyes shut so tight that stars exploded behind my eyelids. "Oh, don't be rude, Jack. Look at me," the passenger whispered, the voice shifting now, sounding less like a stranger and more like my father, who had died 10 years ago. "I've been waiting so long for a ride. Just one look. That's all it takes to pay the toll." The emotional manipulation was a sharp knife twisting in my gut, a cruel trick designed to break my resolve, to force me to open my eyes in shock or grief. I bit the inside of my cheek until I tasted copper, using the sharp pain to ground myself, to remind myself that whatever was sitting next to me was a liar, a parasite wearing the stolen memories of the dead to feed on my fear. Then came the physical contact. A hand, freezing cold and dripping wet, placed itself gently on my right knee, the moisture soaking instantly through my denim jeans and chilling the skin beneath. It wasn't a heavy grip, but a light, testing touch, like a predator seeing if the prey is still alive, sending a jolt of revulsion up my spine that nearly made me vomit. I flinched, my leg jerking involuntarily, and the hand clamped down hard, the fingers digging into my muscle with bruising force, sharp fingernails piercing the fabric. "I know you can feel me," the voice hissed, losing the facade of my father and returning to its natural aquatic rasp. "Open your eyes, driver, look at what you picked up." Outside the truck, the environment began to assault the vehicle. I heard the distinct sound of footsteps emerging from the tree line, not one or two, but dozens, a slow, shuffling march on the asphalt. They surrounded the truck, a legion of the lost, their hands brushing against the metal sides of the cab, creating a sound like dry leaves skittering across a tin roof. Scrape, scrape, scrape. They were testing the perimeter, searching for a way in, their movements unhurried and coordinated, a hive mind of the dead converging on the one living thing foolish enough to be awake. Someone, or something, rapped their knuckles gently on the driver's side window right next to my ear. Knock, knock, knock. "Let us in, it's cold out here," a child's voice pleaded from outside the glass, pitiful and small, a sound that would have broken my heart in any other circumstance. But I knew better. I knew that if I opened my eyes, I wouldn't see a child but something ancient and hungry wearing a child's skin like a suit. I kept my head down, chin to my chest, my body trembling uncontrollably, sweat mingling with the tears leaking from my squeezed shut eyes. The tapping on the glass grew louder, more insistent, changing from a polite knock to a frantic pounding, fists hammering against the reinforced window with enough force to shake the door in its frame. The temperature inside the cab dropped to a point where my teeth began to chatter violently, a sound I couldn't suppress, betraying my terror to the entity surrounding me. The passenger laughed again, a wet, gurgling sound, and I felt the seat shift as it leaned closer, invading my personal space until I could feel the cold radiance of its face inches from my own. "Time is ticking, Jack. But time moves differently here," it whispered, and I heard the sound of a tongue licking chapped lips. "If you don't look at me, I'll have to make you look. I'll have to peel those eyelids back myself." A sharp, metallic screeching noise erupted from the back of the truck, the sound of the cargo doors being forced open, the locks snapping under immense pressure. I froze, my heart skipping a beat, realizing that the sanctity of the cargo hold had been breached, that they were now inside the vehicle, crawling over the medical supplies I was supposed to protect. I could feel the vibrations of heavy movement through the chassis, thuds and drags as things crawled from the trailer toward the front of the cab, seeking the pass-through window that separated the sleeper berth from the driver's seat. The threat was no longer just beside me and outside. It was coming from behind, closing the circle, leaving me nowhere to run. I tried to focus on the time, counting the seconds in my head, trying to estimate how long had passed since the truck stopped. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi. I needed to get to 3:33 a.m. If the legends were true, if the old truckers weren't just spinning yarns, the sun, or at least the shift in spiritual energy, would save me when the clock turned. But time felt elastic, stretched thin like taffy. Minutes felt like hours, and the darkness seemed eternal. A cold, wet finger traced the line of my jaw, moving slowly up to my cheekbone, leaving a trail of slime, inching closer to my eye, ready to pry it open. The wet finger pressed harder against my eyelid, the nail sharp and jagged, threatening to puncture the thin skin and rupture the eyeball beneath if I dared to flinch. I held my breath, my lungs burning with the need for oxygen, forcing my body to remain as rigid as a corpse, knowing that any sudden movement might trigger a violent reaction. "Open them," the passenger hissed, the voice dropping to a guttural growl that vibrated through the seat and into my spine, demanding obedience. I could feel the water dripping from its sleeve onto my shoulder, soaking my shirt with freezing, foul-smelling liquid that felt like ice water mixed with sewage. I concentrated on the darkness behind my eyelids, visualizing a brick wall, a steel door, anything to keep my mind from snapping under the sheer terror of the proximity. From behind me, the thin fabric curtain separating the driver's cab from the sleeper berth was ripped open with a violent, tearing sound, the hooks popping off the rail like gunshots. A draft of air, smelling of ancient dust and ozone, rushed into the front of the cab, carrying with it the unmistakable sound of multiple bodies shuffling into the small space. They were inside the truck with me now, crawling over the mattress where I slept, their knees scraping against the floorboards, their breathing a discordant chorus of wheezes and rattles. I could feel the presence of a crowd pressing against the back of my seat, a dozen eyes boring into the back of my skull, waiting for me to turn around and acknowledge them. The pounding on the windows outside escalated into a frenzied, chaotic rhythm, sounding less like fists and more like stones or hammers striking the reinforced glass. The child's voice that had pleaded for entry was gone, replaced by a cacophony of screams and wails, a choir of the damned begging for release, for heat, for life. "Let us in, it burns out here, it burns," they shrieked, their voices distorting into inhuman frequencies that made my ears ring and my head throb with a blinding migraine. The truck rocked violently from side to side, the suspension groaning in protest, as if the mob outside was trying to tip the rig over and spill me out onto the asphalt like a treat from a vending machine. The radio, which had been silent for a few minutes, exploded into noise again, but this time it wasn't my voice or static. It was the sound of a flatline tone, high-pitched and unwavering. Underneath the tone, a calm, mechanical voice began reciting numbers, coordinates that I realized with a jolt of horror were the exact location where we were stopped. latitude 45.9, longitude 123.4. No survivors. No survivors. The broadcast was announcing my death before it had even happened, treating me as a statistic, a cold fact of the road that had already been processed and filed away. It was a psychological assault designed to make me accept my fate, to make me give up the fight and open my eyes to the inevitable. My physical endurance was beginning to fail. My muscles were cramping from the tension, trembling so violently that the entire seat shook, and my bladder was screaming for relief. The passenger sensed my weakness, its hand moving from my knee to my neck, wrapping long, cold fingers around my throat in a mock caress that promised violence. "You're shaking, Jack," it whispered, the voice sliding into a mock sympathetic tone that was infinitely worse than the threats. "You're tired. It's so much easier to just look. Just one peek and the noise stops. One peek and you can sleep forever." The grip tightened slightly, just enough to restrict my airflow, testing the limits of my panic. I tried to summon the image of the clock in my mind, trying to calculate how much time had passed, but panic had scrambled my internal chronometer completely. Had it been 5 minutes? 10? Or had mere seconds stretched into hours in this hellish purgatory? The concept of 3:33 a.m. felt like a distant, impossible dream, a shore I would never reach before drowning in this ocean of darkness. I began to recite the alphabet backward, then multiplication tables, anything to keep my conscious mind occupied, to prevent it from visualizing the monstrosity sitting inches away from my face. 12 times 12 is 144. Something wet and heavy flopped onto my shoulder from behind, draping over my collarbone. A hand, pale and bloated, belonging to one of the things that had crawled from the sleeper berth. Then another hand grabbed my left arm, and another grasped my hair, weaving icy fingers into my scalp, pulling my head back against the headrest. I was being anchored, held in place by the entities inside the cab, turned into a captive audience for the passenger in the front seat. I wanted to scream, to thrash, to fight, but I knew that physical resistance was useless against things that could walk through walls and survive death. My only weapon was my refusal to witness them, my denial of their power over my senses. "He doesn't want to see us," a new voice spoke from the back, dry and crackling like burning wood, sounding ancient and authoritative. "He thinks he is better than the road. He thinks the rules will save him." The passenger beside me laughed again, a sound that bubbled up through thick sludge. "The rules are for the lucky, Jack. You ran out of luck at mile marker 82. The hand in my hair yanked hard, forcing my chin up, exposing my throat to the darkness, while the fingers on my eyelids pried at the skin, trying to force them apart. I scrunched my face up, using every facial muscle I possessed to keep my eyes sealed, tears leaking out and running down my cheeks, mixing with the swamp water dripping from the entities. "I am not looking. I am not looking," I screamed internally, turning the thought into a mantra, a shield against the physical violation. I could feel the sharp breath of the passenger directly on my lips now. It was so close, inhaling my exhalations, feeding on the panic radiating from my body like heat from a furnace. It was waiting for the moment I broke, the split second where instinct overrode will, and I opened my eyes to check the threat. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed through the cabin, louder than the screaming or the pounding, the distinct, terrifying sound of safety glass failing under pressure. The windshield, which had been holding back the fog and the horrors outside, had finally fractured, a spiderweb crack spreading across the surface directly in front of my face. I could hear the tiny pieces of glass grinding together as the structural integrity gave way, and a draft of outside air, even colder than the air inside, hissed through the fissure. The barrier was failing. The sanctuary of the truck was about to be breached completely, leaving me with nothing between my skin and the night. The cracking of the windshield acted as a dinner bell for the horde outside. The pounding intensified into a frenzied, rhythmic hammering, focused entirely on the spiderweb fracture that was rapidly spreading across the glass directly in front of my face. I could hear the wet slapping of palms and the scraping of bone against the reinforced laminate, weakening the only shield I had left against the night. Tiny shards of glass began to flake off the inside surface, raining down onto my lap and dashboard, glittering like malevolent diamonds in the faint green glow of the dashboard clock. A jet of freezing air, colder than anything I had felt yet, hissed through the breach, carrying with it the overpowering stench of rotting vegetation and the grave, a smell so thick I could taste it on my tongue. I gagged, choking on the foul air, fighting the primal urge to open my eyes and assess the danger that was literally breaking down my door. The passenger took advantage of my distraction, its voice dropping to a soothing, almost hypnotic whisper that slithered directly into my ear canal, bypassing my panicked defenses. "It's breaking, Jack. The cage is opening," it murmured, the wet sound of its lips moving against my ear sending shivers of revulsion down my spine. "Why fight it? We're already inside. Just open your eyes and see the beautiful things waiting for you out in the mist. We have so much to show you." It began to describe itself in gruesome, impossible detail. Skin like waterlogged parchment, eyes that held the crushing depth of the ocean floor, teeth sharpened on river stones, trying to bait my morbid curiosity into a fatal error. Behind me, the entities from the sleeper berth grew tired of merely holding me. Their grip shifted from restraint to active violation, their icy fingers crawling up my face, probing the sockets of my eyes. They dug their thumbs into the corners of my eyelids, pulling the skin taut, trying to physically force them open against my will. The pain was sharp and blinding, tearing at the delicate tissue, but I squeezed my eyes shut harder, grinding my teeth together until I thought my jaw would snap. I was waging a war over millimeters of skin, a desperate, silent battle against a dozen hands that felt like frozen iron, knowing that if I lost even a fraction of an inch, my sanity would be forfeit. The radio, which I had tuned out in my terror, suddenly changed its broadcast again, shifting from the monotone death coordinates to something far more insidious. It began to play a distorted, slowed-down version of a lullaby my mother used to sing to me, the melody twisted into a minor key and overlaid with the sounds of children weeping in a cavernous space. It was psychological torture designed to break my spirit, to weaponize my own memories against me and make me yearn for the comfort of oblivion. The sound filled the cab, drowning out my own internal prayers, making it impossible to focus on anything other than the despair radiating from the speakers. My mental fortitude began to fracture under the combined assault of physical pain, sensory overload, and emotional manipulation. I felt my resolve wavering, the terrifying thought crossing my mind that perhaps looking wouldn't be so bad, that perhaps it would end the pain. Flashes of light began to explode behind my squeezed-shut eyelids, phantom images conjured by my terrified brain, teasing me with what I might see if I just gave in. I felt a profound exhaustion settle over me, a desire to just let go of the steering wheel, let go of the tension, and accept whatever fate the road had decided for me. The struggle felt meaningless when surrounded by beings that defied the laws of life and death. The truck itself seemed to be dying around me, the metal groaning and shrieking under the immense pressure of the swarm pressing in from all sides. The doors were beginning to bend inward in their frames, the seals popping with loud bangs, letting in more drafts of the freezing fog. The roof buckled downward with a terrifying metallic screech, as if something enormous had crawled on top of the cab and was preparing to crush it flat like a soda can. I was trapped inside a collapsing iron lung, the walls closing in to squeeze the last breath of life from my body, and I knew the structure couldn't hold for much longer. "I know you missed your father, Jack," the passenger whispered, playing its final, cruelest card, its voice morphing perfectly into the warm baritone I remembered from my childhood. "He's out there, you know. He's waiting in the fog with the others. He wants to see you, son. Just one look, and I'll let him come to the window." Tears leaked hot and fast from my eyes, mixing with the cold slime on my face, as the grief I had buried for a decade rose up to choke me. It was a lie, I knew it was a lie. A vile trick by a predator that knew my weakest points, but the desperate, lonely child inside me wanted to believe it so badly. I was on the verge of breaking. My facial muscles were spasming uncontrollably, the tension becoming unbearable, and the seductive promise of seeing my father was eroding the last of my willpower. I actually started to relax the muscles around my eyes, preparing to surrender, to open them and face the horror just to make the torment stop. I accepted in that moment that I was going to die on this forgotten road, and I just wanted the end to be swift, to be spared the agony of waiting for the final blow. The passenger sensed my surrender, letting out a triumphant, gurgling hiss of anticipation, its cold breath blasting against my face as it leaned in for the kill. But just as I was about to let my eyelids flutter open, a subtle shift occurred in the atmosphere of the cab, a change in pressure that popped my ears. The frantic pounding on the outside of the truck hesitated for a fraction of a second, a nearly imperceptible pause in the rhythm of the assault. A new sound cut through the cacophony of screams and grinding metal, a sharp, electronic beep from the dashboard, a sound belonging to the world of the living, clear and mechanical. It was followed instantly by the heavy, mechanical clunk of the truck's power locks trying to engage, a jolt of electricity surging through the dead system. Then, with a sound like a gunshot, the windshield finally gave way completely, shattering into thousands of cubes of safety glass that showered inward over my head and shoulders, cutting my face and hands. The freezing fog rushed in unopposed, hitting me with the force of a physical blow, and the roar of the horde outside became deafening, unimpeded by glass. But amidst the chaos of the breach, another sound registered in my brain, the rhythmic chugging of the engine turning over, coughing and sputtering, trying to pull itself back from the grave. Hope, sharp and painful, pierced through the terror as I realized that the rules of the road were shifting once again. The sound of the electronic beep from the dashboard acted like a holy bell tolling in a cathedral, cutting through the chaotic screaming of the damned with piercing clarity. I forced my mind to focus on that sound, and through the haze of terror, I heard the digital clock click over 1 more minute. The green numbers shifted, the 2 flickering and resolving into a 3, reading exactly 3:33 am. The effect was instantaneous and violent. A shockwave of energy, palpable and warm, seemed to pulse outward from the truck itself, repelling the darkness like a magnetic field reversing polarity. The frantic screaming of the horde outside was cut short, not fading away but silenced abruptly as if a heavy door had been slammed shut on a noisy room, leaving a ringing emptiness in the air. The hands that had been clawing at my face and anchoring my head to the seat vanished, dissolving into nothingness, leaving behind only the stinging sensation of the scratches they had inflicted. The crushing weight on the roof of the cab lifted instantly, the metal groaning as it expanded back into shape, and the truck's suspension bounced up, relieved of the ghostly burden it had been carrying. Beside me, the passenger let out one final ear-splitting shriek of pure, impotent rage, a sound that wasn't human, but sounded like tearing metal, before the presence evaporated completely. The freezing cold that had turned the cab into a meat locker dissipated rapidly, replaced by the natural, humid chill of the night air rushing in through the shattered windshield. I didn't open my eyes immediately, paralyzed by the fear that it was another trick, another layer of the psychological torture designed to make me look before it was truly safe. I sat there, shivering uncontrollably, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, listening to the sound of the engine chugging rhythmically, gaining power with every revolution. The radio, which had been broadcasting my death and the twisted lullabies, was now emitting a steady, comforting static, the white noise of a signal trying to find a station. I counted to 10 in my head, my breath coming in ragged gasps, telling myself that if I was dead, I wouldn't be feeling the wind stinging the cuts on my face. Slowly, agonizingly, I peeled my eyelids open, wincing as the dry, irritated tissue separated, and forced myself to look at the dashboard. The green glow of the clock confirmed it. 3:34 am. I turned my head to the right, bracing myself for a jump scare, but the passenger seat was empty. There was no waterlogged corpse, no demon with hollow eyes, just the dark upholstery of the seat. However, the evidence of the visitation was undeniable. The fabric was soaked through with a foul-smelling dark liquid that dripped onto the floor mats, and a pile of river weeds and silt lay on the cushion where the entity had sat. I wasn't crazy. I hadn't hallucinated it. Something from the bottom of a river had ridden shotgun with me for 33 minutes. I didn't wait to inspect the damage further. A primal flight response took over, overriding my exhaustion and pain. I slammed the truck into gear, the transmission engaging with a heavy clunk that felt like the sweetest sound I had ever heard. and stomped on the gas pedal. The truck lurched forward, the tires biting into the asphalt, and I sped away from that cursed stretch of road, the wind roaring through the broken windshield and blasting my face with debris. The headlights were working perfectly now, cutting through the remaining fog with bright white beams that illuminated a familiar sight: mile marker 95. The loop was broken. The road was linear again, and I was moving forward, away from the hell I had been trapped in. I drove like a madman for the next hour, ignoring the speed limits, ignoring the cold wind that numbed my hands, desperate to see the artificial lights of civilization. When the neon sign of a 24-hour truck stop finally appeared on the horizon, glowing red and blue against the pre-dawn sky, I nearly wept with relief. I pulled the battered rig into the parking lot, surrounded by other trucks idling peacefully, and killed the engine. The silence that followed wasn't scary. It was the peaceful mechanical silence of the living world, punctuated by the distant hum of the interstate and the smell of diesel fuel and frying bacon. I stumbled out of the cab, my legs giving way as my adrenaline crashed and fell onto the oily pavement, gasping for air. Under the harsh glare of the parking lot floodlights, the true extent of the night's events was visible on the truck's exterior. The paint on the passenger side was scratched and gouged, as if hundreds of fingernails had tried to peel the metal back, and the door handle was bent almost 90 degrees. But the most chilling detail was the mud, thick, black, swampy mud, that coated the entire lower half of the truck, containing handprints that were far too long and had too many fingers to be human. I walked into the diner, covered in blood from the glass cuts and shivering from hypothermia, drawing stares from the waitress and the few truckers eating breakfast. I didn't care what I looked like. I ordered black coffee and sat in the booth farthest from the window, watching the sun slowly rise over the mountains, burning away the mist. I called my dispatcher right there and quit. I told him to send someone else for the truck, that I was leaving the keys on the counter and walking away. He screamed. He threatened, but his voice sounded tiny and insignificant compared to the voices I had heard in the dark. I knew I could never drive that route again, could never sit in a cab at night and watch the clock tick toward the devil's hour. I took a bus home that morning, leaving my career and my livelihood behind in a parking lot off Route 9, and I haven't driven a car at night since. I work a desk job now, in a bright office with lots of windows and people, safe in the city where the lights never truly go out. But sometimes when I'm alone in my apartment and the silence settles in, I can still smell that distinct odor of stagnant river water and decay. I'll wake up in a cold sweat at exactly 3 a.m., my heart hammering, feeling a phantom dampness on my shoulder, and I have to turn on every light in the house just to convince myself I'm not back in that cab. So, take this as a warning from a man who learned the hard way. Superstitions exist for a reason, and the old-timers on the road aren't just telling ghost stories to pass the time. If you are ever driving late at night, on a lonely stretch of highway where the trees block out the stars, and you see the clock tick to 2:59 a.m., pull over, stop the car, turn off the engine, and wait it out, no matter how late you are or how silly you feel. Because there are things out there in the dark that are looking for a ride, and once you let them in, they never truly leave you.